Since time immemorial, Native Americans have represented their world through art. Whether on animal hides or on stone, Indigenous Americans recognize their world in the art they created. How would outsiders represent Native Americans to the world beyond America? When Columbus brought Europeans to the New World, their image was carefully shared by European artists. These European artists showed Native Americans overcome by appearance of strong, intrepid explorers. Hiding and trembling in fear, these were images of people meeting their superiors. All these images were contrived, this one showing Taínos meeting Spaniards on fairly equal terms. This one suggesting fair and even trade. In the early days of Spanish settlement in America, Theodore de Bry produced images based on descriptions of Europeans who witnessed events in America. This is one of his images of Taínos paddling a boat. This one showing Taínos cooking fish. Theodore de Bry also created engravings of Bartolomé de las Casas, scenes witnessed by de las Casas of Spaniards abusing Taínos in America. De las Casas included these images in his manuscript, documenting torture and murder at the hands of his fellow Spaniards. He hoped to get the attention of the king to stop the savage abuse of America's native people. De Bry's physical representation of Native Americans makes them look more like European people, but the horror of the events was clearly communicated. Enslavement was faithfully depicted. De Bry recreated the scene of a massacre of missionaries at the hands of Native Americans fed up with slavers, wrongly blaming the priests. He produced image of the Secoton village in North America, showing its agricultural status. De Bry's images of Native Americans reflect the lack of personal observation, even in a book entitled Grand Voyages. While their presence is duly noted, De Bry's Native Americans display little individuality. Yet his depictions of the indigenous world informed Europeans of the physical elements of that world. There would follow more accurate representations of the Taíno people, both in paintings and in photographs, much later. Meanwhile, images of Spanish explorers emerged, usually flattering pictures like this one of Balboa claiming the Pacific Ocean for Spain. Native Americans are shown as victims of torture and murder as Balboa turns his dogs loose on these Native Americans. Vasco Núñez de Balboa inspired these statues in America and in Spain in Madrid, but while he lives on in 3 dimensions, his physical life ended at the hands of fellow Spaniards. He was beheaded by political rivals. Aztec warriors are shown as strong opponents, but not strong enough to survive the sword of Hernán Cortés. The Prado Museum in Madrid has this image of Cortés, and Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City has this one. His black and white portrait is in the collection of the Library of Congress. Aztec leader Montezuma is identifiable only by his throne in this rendering of his meeting with Cortés. In this rendering of the conquest of Mexico, we see mostly Spaniards. In Mexico City, these statues represent the Aztecs at the founding of their capital, Tenochtitlan. In South America, the fall of the Inca Empire is illustrated in the Battle of Cusco, the Inca appearing like space aliens. It hadn't been a long time since Inca founder Manco Capac had consolidated his power. Huáscar and his brother Atahualpa were in a struggle for power when Francisco Pizarro came with Spaniards seeking gold and conquest. This rendering of Atahualpa shows the Spanish conquistadors trying to convert him to Christianity. Artists in other regions of South America sought to reflect people and their surroundings in documentary sketches and paintings. South American Indians in Brazil are the subject of artist Albert Eckhout. Eckhout was among the first European artists to feature Native Americans. He traveled through Dutch Brazil with the governor to record the people, plants, and animals of the region. He strove to be accurate in his renderings. Also in Brazil, artist Hercule Florence took advantage of a chance to travel up the Amazon River. Here's one of the scenes he produced, showing Native Americans there. He joined an expedition led by a baron doing exploratory work for the Russian Academy of Sciences. Eckhout and Florence both produced art featuring people they actually met, rather than from descriptions given by others. Jean-Baptiste Debray later worked in South America, capturing this scene of slave raiders with their Native American victims. Native Americans in today's Canada were represented as well. In 1535, French explorer Jacques Cartier made contact with the St. Lawrence Iroquois, a scene reproduced in art. His meeting with elders at Hochelaga displays individual features of the village leaders, as well as his French entourage. George Agnew Reed painted this scene of Samuel de Champlain arriving years later, being greeted by the Wendat tribe. Champlain did much of his own drawing, as well as cartography. He rendered this drawing of the attack on Iroquois warriors at the head of Wendat trespassers. Champlain's firing of an arquebus, the first ever seen by these native people, is rendered in greater detail here. Champlain's travels throughout the region were legendary. Native Americans are seen supporting his journeys. The fur trade expanded throughout French America, involving contact with new American tribes. We see Native Americans here participating in this trade. Much of the art documenting Native Americans during historical events was produced long after these events occurred. By the 19th century, Dutch-born Canadian artist Cornelius Kriefhoff romanticized both Native Americans, like this Wendat using a moose call, and the spectacular landscape of the Canadian frontier. Born in the Netherlands, Kriefhoff left a legacy of art for Canadians. His friendship with the Mohawks helped him gain access and cultural insights into the native people and settlers in the region. Another Canadian artist painting Native Americans was Frances Ann Hopkins. She married a Hudson's Bay Company official and witnessed life on the Canadian frontier, traveling from post to post. While some of her renderings are described as highly romanticized, her work reflected the complexity of life for Native Americans in Canada. Native Americans were deeply involved in the fur trade, and her close connection to the Hudson Bay Company resulted in dramatic portrayals of voyageurs. Frances Ann Hopkins was a British citizen, but her time in Canada resulted in national treasures for that country. Further south, native people are shown witnessing the French claiming the Mississippi River. Yet the Spanish had claimed the river years before, during the expedition of Hernando de Soto. Native people are depicted as overwhelmed by the mighty Spaniards, notwithstanding the fact that neither de Soto nor his band endured here. Regardless of which country European explorers came from, contact with them was devastating to Native Americans, as depicted in the Florentine Codex. Comanche warriors made their appearance on canvas in the destruction of the St. Sabah mission in Texas. English colonizers made their entry to North America in the land of the Secotan at Roanoke Island. Governor John White reflected the way of life of the Secotan, including their physical likeness. His renderings were the first seen by many English people, helping Europeans form mental images of the people native to America. Governor White witnessed many Native American activities and maintained good relations. The colony developed enough for baptism of his granddaughter, but supply failures imperiled the colony. When Smith returned with delayed supplies, he found the colony deserted. The colonists seemed to have vanished, leaving the colony a failure, but his renderings endured. Further north in Virginia, Captain John Smith rendered this image of the Powhatans. The colony of Jamestown was established and endured despite the Jamestown massacre. The English colony at Plymouth also endured after a welcoming by Samoset of the Wampanoag. Trade with Native Americans developed, the Iroquois trading with the English. French fur traders in Canada traded with rivals of the Iroquois. While colonies like New Sweden maintained peaceful relations with native people, mistreatment by colonizers resulted in violent uprisings by Native American groups, including King Philip's War, recorded by artists. Many historical events were reflected in art produced years after the event. This treaty signing in the 1700s was produced in 1820 by Benjamin West. This highly inaccurate rendering of Pocahontas saving John Smith was produced in 1870, long after the lifetime of the subjects. The first Thanksgiving, said to take place in 1621, was painted by Jean Léon Jerome Ferris in 1899. The Pilgrims did not dress as shown in the painting, and the Wampanoag are shown dressed as Plains Indians. Pontiac's uprising occurred in 1763, but this drawing was produced in 1879. This striking picture of Pontiac gathering supporters was produced 100 years later. In the early and mid-1800s, painter George Catlin painted American Indians he saw in person. He traveled extensively in the West, his first tour with William Clark, when Clark was then governor of the territory. Catlin spent years living with and making paintings of Western Indians. One of his first residencies was with the Mandan, painting Mandan rituals and lifeways. He also painted portraits of Mandan leaders and other tribal members. Soon after Catlin left the Mandan, a steamboat arrived, and smallpox spread through the village, leaving few Mandan survivors. Catlin visited numerous tribes during his travels, painting stunning portraits of Pawnee, Omaha, Ponca, Cheyenne, Crow, and Blackfeet, among others. He painted this scene of Ojibwe portaging around the falls at St. Anthony, and this Ojibwe dance, and he traveled on. Catlin made dramatic paintings of buffalo and Comanche feats of horsemanship. In later travels, Catlin documented ball play of the Choctaws in his travels to the South. He made 5 expeditions in North America, determined to document the ways and people of as many tribes as possible. Catlin's burning interest in Native Americans dates back to the stories he heard about his grandfather's death and scalping at the Wyoming Massacre during colonial times. He encountered an Indian when he was still a boy in Pennsylvania. That Indian befriended his family. Catlin advocated for Native Americans and praised their ways of life in books he wrote, including one for children. He hoped to change attitudes about Native people in the minds of the public and in the halls of Congress. This painting reflects Native American leaders visiting Washington, D.C., and then returning to their tribes. He produced over 500 paintings reflecting Native American life and people as individuals. Catlin painted notable American Indian leaders in U.S. wars against the Indians. This one of Tenskwatawa in Tecumseh's War. Keokuk of the Black Hawk War is rendered here, and the amazing portrait of Seminole leader Osceola, days before he died as a prisoner. Catlin's ability to bring his portrait subjects to life is self-evident, but his work impoverished him. Catlin's curiosity and sense of adventure brought him to travel and paint in South America. These travels resulted in a second body of work. His initial collection of 500 pieces were never purchased by Congress, despite Catlin's determined efforts. His work was finally purchased by a railroad baron, and from there to the Smithsonian Museum. Catlin dedicated his life to creating and attempting to sell his art, determined to document the people and ways of Native Americans before they vanished. His incredible work is in the Smithsonian and scattered in various museums across the country. Writer Suzanne Reich published a book about George Catlin entitled Painting the Wild Frontier. Following in the footsteps of George Catlin, Carl Bodmer ascended the Missouri River on a 2,500-mile expedition led by a German prince. Bodmer was celebrated for his accuracy in watercolors of native people of the West, as well as other sights he witnessed with the German prince. Bodmer recreated events such as the scalp dance of the Minitaris. Reproducing landscapes of the region was one job the Swiss painter had on the expedition. Another was the full-body portraits of leaders. Like Catlin before him, Bodmer spent time with the Mandan, creating images of their culture, taking us inside the chief's lodge. This famous sketch of a Mandan village. He also visited the Sioux, creating this horse race in watercolor. Bodmer's art reflected a number of Native American cultures and individuals.
Hey,
Carl Bodmer's time among the Western Indians was limited, yet he produced an extensive body of work. After the expedition ended, his artwork was featured in the Baron's book about those travels. Another artist, American Alfred Jacob Miller, entered the West at about the same time, hired by Scottish adventurer Sir William Drummond Stewart to record his hunting trip in the Rocky Mountains. The fur trade was still active in the West, a trade that included Native Americans. Alfred Jacob Miller also painted interactions between Indians and whites, the Great Migration on the Oregon Trail, actions of the United States during Manifest Destiny. The work of Alfred Jacob Miller can be seen at the Walters Art Museum and others. Artist and intrepid traveler Paul Kane was an Irish-born Canadian who traveled deep into the Canadian frontier and Pacific Northwest in the company of voyageurs from the Hudson's Bay Company. Kane was inspired by George Catlin to use art to document the way of life of Native Americans before those ways vanished. While his field notes held true to his experience during his travels, Kane's paintings veered from that knowledge, leaning toward more dramatic images, popular with European and Euro-American buyers. Many of his travels were in today's Canada, sketching participants in the beaver trade. Lake Huron, Sault Ste. Marie, and other northern lands brought Kane face to face with Indian nations there, including the Cree. His travel with fur brigades of the Hudson's Bay Company brought him in contact with the Métis, people with both Native American and French heritage, people who were vital to the fur trade. Kane encountered the Blackfoot Federation, tribes who entered the fur trade with the Hudson's Bay Company. The fur brigades brought Paul Kane to Fort Vancouver in Oregon country of the Pacific Northwest. This is where he witnessed an eruption of Mount St. Helens. Kane is noted for accurately depicting the eruption from a side vent instead of through the mountaintop, as many artists had done. Paul Kane captured the great salmon fishery on the Columbia River. Kane followed that mighty river to the mouth, capturing this scene with Mount Hood in the background. Kane's extensive travels in Canada and the Pacific Northwest provide priceless notes and sketches of First Nations and American Indian life. His dramatic paintings are a vital part of the patrimony of Canada. This dramatic painting is by artist Charles Bird King. Unlike George Catlin and Carl Bodmer and others, King never traveled to meet and sketch Native Americans. Native Americans came to him. Well, sort of. An accomplished portrait artist, King had a commission from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. When Native American leaders came to Washington, D.C. to do business with the government, they posed for King. King is noted for his care in using the correct cultural symbols, the right hairstyles, clothing, and jewelry, for example. Some of his subjects were prominent Native American historic figures, like Sauk leader Keokuk. Add to that list Red Jacket, Manawa, the Red Chief, Pushmatahawa, Little Crow of the Sioux, Major Ridge of the Cherokee, Chief Black Hawk of the Sauk, and you have a sampling of Indian leaders who traveled east to meet the government officials in high places, often the president, and receive promises that were rarely kept. Painted images of Native Americans had come a long way, from balding European heads on alien bodies to images of real American Indian individuals, thanks to artists like Charles Bird King. During the time when George Catlin was traveling the American West, a child was born in Prussia, German painter Albert Bierstadt. His paintings of American Indians were inseparable from the Western landscape. It was landscape that Bierstadt was best known for, achieving world fame for his dramatic and compelling artwork of the landscape where so many Native Americans lived their lives. Bierstadt's landscapes captured the interest and passions of many Europeans and played some role in attracting settlers, a role in America's manifest destiny, which devastated so many Native American communities. Bierstadt's dramatic landscape paintings fell out of favor at the turn of the century. Native Americans of the West were painted on the canvas of Frederick Remington. Remington was born in 1861, the first year of the Civil War. His father was a colonel in the Union Army and saw little of Frederick during his first 4 years of life. In the 1880s, Remington first traveled west to capture the lives of Native Americans as well as cowboys and soldiers. Unlike Bierstadt, Remington's renderings of the landscape was not his focus, nor were the faces of Native Americans. His art was about storytelling. Mood and action gave his work a narrative quality. Remington's The Luckless Hunter reflected his sense of vanishing American Indians. By the time of Remington's travels, interactions with white people, especially with traders, were commonplace among the tribes. Even the titles of his pieces evoked a sense of action and mystery, like the episode of the buffalo gun. Remington believed in engaging the imagination of his viewers, generating questions and hypotheses about scenes like this one. Remington's paintings and illustrations were very popular with the public in America and in Europe, allowing him to command a high price for his work from buyers. Interactions with whites are explored in this painting, Shotgun Hospitality. A good example of his use of tension. Many of the Native Americans Remington met were scouts with the U.S. Army, like these Cheyenne scouts. While the fur trade had long since declined by 1889, Remington painted this scene of an Indian trapper. Remington was also fascinated by soldiers, and he spent much of his travels embedded with Army troops. Hence, he witnessed much of the military actions against Native Americans in the West, but always focused on the soldier. He illustrated the interactions of the Army with Indian scouts. Remington's best-known passion was with cowboys, capturing the peril they often faced and the wildness of the land where they worked. But there were also calmer scenes of the West. Remington also produced sculptures, one of which he gave to President Theodore Roosevelt. This one resides in the National Gallery of Art. Less successful were his paintings and sketches he did of historical events, like this one of early French explorer Radisson and the incredible journey of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. His rendering of the Coronado excursion is perhaps the best known of these, a work that is rich in the sense of movement. Tension is high in the rendering of the Meyer expedition, the drawing of the Black Bean. The Mexican army looks intimidating in this painting, the Mexican Major. Remington's work had a major influence on the perception of Americans, of Native Americans of the West, and of the West itself. His goal was to sell paintings, and his dramatic narrative work established him as a very successful artist and as a national treasure. Charles Marion Russell also brought Western Indians to the eyes of the world. Born in 1864, the year of the Navajo Long Walk, Russell grew up in St. Louis, hearing tales of adventure from travelers, from traders, soldiers, and cowboys moving through. Unlike Remington, Russell's Wild West often included an Indian perspective. This painting he titled "When the Land Belonged to God." Russell's orientation was highly influenced by the years he lived with the Piegan of the Blackfeet. In paintings and in sculpture, Russell captured the drama of Indian life in the Old West. Charles Russell painted some historical moments in the history of the West, here discovering the Lewis and Clark expedition on the Missouri River. This one of Lewis and Clark meeting the Flatheads, and this one of the Chinook meeting the Corps of Discovery on the Columbia River. Russell painted the Battle of the Little Bighorn, also known as the Greasy Grass and Custer's Last Stand. Unlike other artists, Russell depicts the battle from the perspective of American Indians. Speaking of battles, intertribal warfare is illustrated in this work, titled "When Blackfoot and Sioux Meet." This shows a more peaceful meeting. The text says, "Many snows have fallen since the Blackfeet and Sioux smoked." Russell's years living with the Blackfeet were preceded with living the life of his other passion, cowboys. Russell rode with cowboys, working cattle drives. He also did ranch work. So, as with the Indians, Russell lived the life he painted. Russell produced 4,000 works of art, spending his adult years in Montana. Known as America's cowboy artist, Russell also wrote books and advocated for Indians in the West. He lobbied for landless Ojibwe to get a reservation. 2,000 of his works are on display at the C.M. Russell Museum Complex in Great Falls, Montana. Museums in Cody, Wyoming, and Fort Worth, Texas, also have works by Charles Marion Russell. Native Americans are present in the illustrations by Charles William Jeffries. Jeffries was a newspaper illustrator, working mostly for Canadian publications. He also drew scenes from history that took place long before he was born, like Radisson in an Indian camp in 1660. Jeffries became involved in education, illustrating textbooks on Canadian history. This one shows Governor Frontenac inciting Ohio Valley Indians to attack English foes. Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames occurred over 100 years before Jeffries produced this illustration, and this one of Tecumseh rescuing soldiers. Tecumseh meets General Brock in this work by Jeffries, and further back in time, with Native Americans welcoming Samuel de Champlain. Jeffries also sketched Mesoamerican ruins in Mexico, including the Great Palace of Mitla in Oaxaca, Palenque's royal court, and the governor's palace at Uxmal, both Mayan cities. While Jeffries never saw the historical figures he drew, his work included Native Americans, and he did see the ruins at pre-Columbian cities in Mexico. Artist John Carl Hillers carried neither a paintbrush nor sketch pad to Indian country. He carried a camera. After a military career begun in the Civil War, Hillers was hired to photograph Colonel Powell's exploration of the Grand Canyon. Hillers' documentation of the expedition helped to establish this awe-inspiring landscape as a precious national treasure worthy of protection. This experience also inspired Hiller to photograph indigenous cultures of the American Southwest. Hiller's work included ruins long ago abandoned, but he also photographed pueblos with Native Americans included in these ancient abodes. Hiller found work as a government photographer. His job was to document this country as it was through photography. Native Americans were sometimes the subjects of his photographs, like this Paiute demonstrating hunting with a rifle, and Native American leader Black Cole. This ceremonial group of Hopi or Navajo is preserved by the National Archives. Native Americans sometimes posed for Hiller, like these Cherokee boys, but Hillers mostly captured Native Americans and Indian country as they appeared, functioning as a documentarian. At about the same time, photographer Ben Whittick was photographing Indians of the American Southwest. Whittick used his photography to support himself in business. He set up his studio in a tent, which he moved across the region. Whittick posed Native Americans with props he carried with him. Whittick contacted various tribes to photograph full-body portraits, posing with his props, many of them posing outside. He befriended Apaches and Navajos, those from Hopi and Zuni communities, giving him access to spiritual rites that were normally closed to outsiders. Some of his subjects were notable people like the son of Mangus Coloradus. He won his own notoriety with this picture he took of Apache warrior Geronimo, and Whittick is believed to be the photographer of outlaw Billy the Kid. Not all were notable or famous subjects. Some photos were of everyday life, like this one of a Navajo bear hunt. With the Zuni, Whittick formed close relationships, participating in some religious ceremonies. He was especially obsessed with the snake dance, wherein rattlesnakes were tamed to bring prayers for rain into the earth. At Fort Wingate, Wittick suffered a snake bite from which he later died, as foretold by a Zuni shaman. John C. Grable photographed American Indians on the northern Great Plains. He traveled the West during a time known as the Early Reservation Period. Many of his images were made during the Indian Wars. This horse, named Comanche, is said to be the only survivor of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. While Graybill didn't photograph actual battles, he took photos of participants, like this man, said to be the instigator of the Indian Revolt at Pine Ridge. Events like councils with Sioux Indians were recorded with his camera. Graybill captured images of Sioux warriors in South Dakota, where he did most of his work. He recorded peaceful scenes during this violent time, and he took a photo that included the famous warrior Red Cloud. Graybill spent time with the U.S. Army during this war, producing images of soldiers and their officers. Indian leaders like Bigfoot worked hard to keep peace between the Sioux and the Army. These chiefs counseled with General Nelson Miles, the top commander in the region. Graybill documented this kind of interaction between Native Americans and U.S. officials. Graybill's interest was also in mining, and when gold was discovered in the Black Hills, he documented the activity on land sacred to the Sioux. He documented the development of Deadwood, a notoriously violent place. When the railroad was built, he documented that as well. Graybill also documented the cattle drives, his signature piece being the cowboy. He took this image of Devil's Tower and of 70 Indian scouts. This image is anything but ordinary. You see, these hot-kissed guns were fired at Wounded Knee, igniting tents where Sioux women and children were sleeping, killing hundreds. Days later, Graybill took these images, what's left of Bigfoot's band, and survivors of the Wounded Knee massacre. This image of General Miles and staff reminds us of the general's sharp criticism of the officer who defied his orders and tried to disarm Bigfoot's band, an action that set off the massacre. Photographer William S. Soulet's Western sojourn began in 1870 when he found work at Fort Dodge in Kansas. Soulet was a Union officer in the Civil War who was wounded at the Battle of Antietam. Soon after the war was over, Soulet headed west, and after an additional year, this time at Camp Supply, Soulet moved to Fort Bliss, where he was hired to document the fort's construction. This gave Soulet a chance to photograph Comanche, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Caddo Indians. He also photographed Apache and Apache Kiowa and other Native Americans in the region. Soulet photographed this Comanche camp, a Comanche chief, and this figure he labeled Comanche in winter. He witnessed and documented activities at the fort, like the drawing of rations at the agency. His work included individuals and their families. This one of Esaketa, a Kiowa Apache also known as Pacer. This portrait is identified as Pacer's son, and this one as Pacer's nephew. A man known as Powder Face is the subject of this photo. Soulet also included his family. Soulet produced unforgettable portraits of Native Americans in the region: Kicking Bird, Little Raven, Lone Wolf, Bird Chief, Black Hawk, and Caddo George Washington, as well as a Caddo village. For 6 years, Soule photographed and shared images of Native Americans, showing their humanity during great and challenging changes.
Oh, we are way, oh, we are, oh, we are, we are, we ho, we are, oh, we are, way.
Some of his subjects were important historical figures. White Bear, a Kiowa chief who traveled to Washington, D.C., and met with President Abraham Lincoln. Also known as Satanta, he poses with the medal given him by the president. Satanta was a leader and a major figure in the violent struggles in this area. While Soule captured images of important Native American leaders, like Lone Wolf here, his photo entitled Scalped Morrison is widely distributed, often included in textbooks. Soule's photography is an important documentation of Western Indians at a time of their great struggle to survive an expanding United States of America. The sun dance is a widespread and powerful ritual important to Indian tribes of the Great Plains. The power to unify and heal kept the ceremony alive. It also had the power to capture, at least in the case of a Washington photographer. After seeing the ceremony at the end of the 19th century, this photographer would dedicate his life to capturing the culture of Native Americans in North America before that culture died. His name was Edward Sheriff Curtis, and no one produced more photos, writings, and voice recordings of North American Indians. Curtis grew up in Minnesota, and his neighbors still shared the memories of the Sioux Uprising of 1862. His explorations took him to scenes of the not-so-long-ago violence. Curtis also developed a love for the outdoors. His family moved to the bustling city of Seattle, and it was there that Curtis became a professional photographer. Curtis spent time on the shores of Puget Sound, always accompanied by his camera. Some Native Americans still lingered here, and some were subjects of photos taken by Curtis. His approach was to create artistic scenes with photography, invoking a time in the past when Indians were more present. He also used exposure and shadow to hide modern clothing and other signs of change. One subject on that shore was a Duwamish woman known locally as Princess Angeline. She was a daughter of Chief Seattle. She was happy to pose for Curtis, preferring the silver dollar he paid over digging and selling clams. This photo brought Curtis great notoriety. It was praised and embraced by artists across the world who had hopes of gaining acceptance of photography as artistic expression. Edward Curtis was making a name for himself when he accepted the invitation to be photographer for the Harriman expedition to Alaska. On that expedition, Curtis learned the methods of ethnographic research. But he then went on his own expeditions, using earnings from his photography studio to fund field work. While Alaska had been a great adventure, Curtis traveled south and then east, setting up in the American Southwest. With a wagon load of photography equipment, including heavy glass plates, Curtis indulged his curiosity about Zuni and Hopi communities, spending months forming relationships with the people and capturing images of their rich communal lives. These Pueblo communities were visually intriguing, as were the people living in them. His portrait of this child, entitled Hopi Angel, is part of the Edward Curtis collection in the Library of Congress. Curtis became part of the community where he did his field work, giving him acceptance and access that allowed a rare glimpse into the ritual life of the Pueblos. Curtis also did evocative landscape work, described as creating paintings with his camera, like this view of the ancient pueblo of Acoma. The landscape provided a sense of scale in the old trail at Acoma. Curtis used his camera to document the lives of the people, yet he produced more than photos, writing about the customs and practices of the communities where he lived much of the year. He also produced portraits that brought his subjects to life, very much humanizing them for viewers of his work. There was a great curiosity about Native Americans from this region, and Curtis helped share the beauty of these people. It's iconic even today, this grand view of Canyon de Chelly in the heart of Deneta, home of the Navajo. Towering, almost temple-like geology, along with riders made tiny in this grand setting, all traveling on horseback, going where? You may have never heard of Edward Curtis, but chances are you've seen this view. Curtis remembered the history when Kit Carson led the U.S. Army here, attacking Navajo people on sight, poisoning their water supply, and pursuing survivors into the Canyon de Muerto, the Canyon of Death. After destroying the flocks of sheep that made up the food supply, along with peach trees, the Army had no trouble gathering the starving Navajo and driving them in a forced march to Bosque Redondo, where thousands of them died. Now it was 1904, and Edward Curtis brought his camera and other gear to the Navajo reservation, using his artistic gifts to produce images of Navajo life. Curtis endeavored to evoke visions of the past, saving what he could of pre-Columbian culture. Native spiritual life was always of interest to Curtis. Navajo sand paintings were central to their healing ways. During his time with the Navajos, Curtis formed relationships with shamans, often called medicine men in that time. Some religious ceremonies were closed to outsiders, and many photographers had been unable to record them. Curtis expected to record one of these ceremonies, but he arrived too late. The ceremony had already taken place, and the masks were already buried until the next year. Through the interpretation of a friend who grew up with the Navajo, Curtis convinced some Navajos to remake the masks and to perform parts of the ceremony for his cameras. This was a huge coup for Curtis as a photographer, but it brought more restrictions from the government to the Navajo and made his friend unwelcome among the Navajo community in which he had been raised. The Nez Perce were also a subject of Curtis's work. The Nez Perce were forced into a war with the United States Army, showing prowess and decency during a moving battle of over 1,000 miles. It was left to Chief Joseph to surrender the cold, starving Nez Perce, and when Chief Joseph came to Seattle, Curtis eagerly took this portrait. It's that portrait, and this one entitled Mojave Girl, that got Curtis an invitation to take portraits of Theodore Roosevelt's children. Curtis added a portrait of Roosevelt himself. This gave Curtis a chance to explain his work to Roosevelt in person. Wanting this vital past of the United States history preserved, Roosevelt highly recommended Curtis and pledged to do everything in his power to help in his difficult mission.
But Mr. Curtis, because of the singular combination of qualities with which he has been blessed, and because of his extraordinary success in making and using his opportunities, has been able to do what no other man ever has done, what, as far as we can see, no other man could do.
Curtis emerged even more inspired. Roosevelt wrote the foreword in Curtis's first volume of The North American Indian.
Mr. Curtis, in publishing this book, is rendering a real and great service, a service not only to our own people, but to the world of scholarship everywhere. Theodore Roosevelt, October 1st, 1906.
Curtis spent most of his time in the field and made it possible for people to meet individual Native Americans from the Yuma, Pomo, Nez Perce, Hoopa, Klamath, Wishram, Crow, Navajo, Apache, Sioux, Zuni, Snake, Blackfoot, Yurok, Suquamish, Modoc, Comanche, Salishan, Kawiya, Umatilla, Arikara, Yakima, Caddo, Assiniboine, Cheyenne, and many more stunning portraits. Curtis threw himself into his work, photographing portraits and scenes from the lives of his subjects. He was spending more time in the field and less time in Seattle with his family. He was racing against assimilation, desperate to capture the traditional ways of these Native Americans while elders were still alive, with their memories and language. And yet, assimilation was the future the government saw, the most humane and beneficial goal in the eyes of humanitarians of the day. While Curtis had no lack of enthusiasm or talent, his finances fell short of his ambitions. It's said that railroad magnate J.P. Morgan refused Curtis's request for financial backing until he saw this photo of Mosa. He agreed to back the project with $75,000 and some conditions. Curtis was to produce 20 leather-bound volumes with ethnographic text and his high-quality photos. No publisher would invest in this, so Curtis would self-publish, financed by selling subscriptions before the work was completed. Curtis hired newspaper reporter William Myers to be his field assistant, who used extraordinary linguistic and stenographer skills to document interviews with elders and shaman, capturing cultural material that was vital to this project. Morgan's money only covered half of Curtis's field expenses: a wagon and team of horses, cameras and glass plates, developing equipment, and food for his long periods in the field. These conditions were often challenging.
At times, the undertaking was made congenial by our surroundings in beautiful mountain wild, in the depths of primeval forest, in the refreshing shade of canyon wall, or in the homes and sacred places of the Indians themselves. While at others, the broiling desert sun, the sandstorm, the flood, the biting blast of winter lent anything but pleasure to the task.
Each year, Curtis visited the Hopi, determined to participate in the snake dance. In this parched region, rain was essential to life. Through the snake dance, rattlesnakes would carry prayers for rain into the earth. Curtis befriended a Hopi shaman who adopted him as a son. This allowed Curtis to participate in the ritual, which involved capturing and bringing snakes into the kiva, where they were tamed with feathers. For many nights, Curtis and the shaman remained here, fasting and sleeping in the kiva with the snakes. Finally, the shaman emerged for the snake dance before the community. Curtis declined to do so for concern about publicity.
Oh, we are way, oh, we are, oh, we are, we are, we ho, we are, oh, we are, way, oh, we are, oh, we are, we are, we ho, we are, oh, we are, oh, we are, oh, we are, we are, we ho, we are.
On the northern plains, the Crow had enjoyed mostly good relations with the United States, and while there were trust issues with the government, many saw reason to welcome Curtis. Edward Curtis had great respect for Native American cultures. He also had respect for those individuals, many of whom were struggling with the reservation era. The mutual respect that ensued opened doors for Curtis beyond the Crow Reservation. It was Crow tribal members who introduced Curtis to Red Cloud of the Lakota Sioux and brought him to the Pine Ridge Reservation, Wounded Knee Massacre Site, and Little Bighorn Valley, where willing Sioux tribal members reenacted the historic battle for Curtis's camera. Curtis produced portraits of notable Crow subjects, including Custer's Scouts, White Man Runs Him, Curly, Two Leggings, and Crow leader Plenty Coups. These Crow tribal members constituted a support team for Curtis, and like many other American Indians, formed deep friendships with him. Curtis spent a great deal of time with the Crow, capturing photos of their lives and culture. This is a Crow burial platform, and here Crow Indians offer food to the Great Spirit. This hook staff had a role when Crow war parties encountered an enemy. It served the purpose of a flag. When the leader planted the pole in the ground, the warriors would not retreat behind this staff. With help from Crow tribal members, Curtis documented many aspects of Crow life. They also helped Curtis create artistic images, those which told stories without the need for words. For all the friendship and ease that Native Americans gave him, Curtis lived a grueling life. His son caught scarlet fever and almost died during field work. Curtis never had enough money to pay his expenses, and his wife divorced him. Images of pre-assimilation life became harder to get as clothing and possessions changed appearances, and traditional ways of life were rapidly passing away. Curtis was far from alone in experiencing hardship. Life on reservations was brutal and sometimes deadly for Native Americans. Yet his years of field work on the Great Plains did not prepare him for the level of suffering he witnessed on California reservations and rancherias. Some ways of life were hard to maintain, like the Wokus harvest and the sweat lodge. The hoopah provided some of Curtis's iconic images of Native American life before reservations. While there was much debilitating poverty in the lives of California Indians, there was richness, a richness in diversity, especially reflected in over 200 languages, a fact that astounded Curtis. Customs were also diverse, Curtis documenting this Yurok cemetery. But it wasn't easy getting photos like these. Many California Indians worked on ranches, and traditional clothing and activities were hard to find. Curtis headed north to Oregon, exploring what was left of the Great Columbia River salmon fishery. There he met and spent time with the Wishrams, a remnant of the once powerful yet hospitable keepers of Celilo Falls. There was still enough cultural memory for portraits in traditional dress, like this one. While Curtis found many old fishing villages along the Columbia River deserted, he found some carrying on the tradition of fishing as he navigated the river to its mouth. Curtis also traveled southeast to spend time with the Klamath, some of the first Pacific Northwest Indians to be attacked by the United States. Curtis witnessed so much suffering in California and Oregon that his mission was taking an emotional toll. The process of assimilation cut at the spiritual life as well as the physical life of Native Americans. Seeking indigenous people with less influence from assimilation, Curtis headed north to Alaska and Canada's British Columbia. There he met the Kwakiutl. Steeped in the northern Pacific Northwest culture, Curtis found a rich source of information for his ethnology work, audio recordings, and, of course, photographs. Curtis had been shooting some motion picture film, and he decided that these were just the people to help him produce a movie. They worked with him to film In the Land of the Headhunters. All the actors were Kwakiutl, and costumes, masks, and movie sets had to be made. Curtis produced the movie, and it was received with rave reviews. Here's the trailer. While In the Land of the Headhunters was well received by critics, Curtis lost money on it. It never enjoyed wide circulation. Curtis drove himself on, but the world he sought to capture was rapidly passing away. The solution to this dilemma was to be found further north, to the people of the Arctic. This time, Curtis included his daughter Beth in his fieldwork, an experience she deeply treasured, despite many hardships, dangers, and close calls. This was a land of very harsh conditions, where caches were used to store essentials to get through the long, dark winters. People lived in small groups, performing ceremonies on a small scale compared to some groups in warmer climes. Most important, Edward and Beth noted how happy and contented the people were, people who had not yet encountered the influence of missionaries. Curtis folded all his field notes and photos into this work, The North American Indian, publishing volumes over the years as his resources and time permitted, and always struggling to pay the people dedicated to this gigantic project. Scattered throughout the 20 volumes were Curtis's pictures of Native American children. Wax cylinders like this one was used by Curtis to record speech and music of the American Indians he visited.
It's so amazing just to see that thing.
Definitely.
Curtis recorded over 2,000 of these during his years in ethnology and photography. In some cases, Native Americans hoping to recover their languages have only this resource. Curtis's work is also valued by Native Americans hoping to bring back ceremonies and religious rituals otherwise lost to time. Indians' ways of life and their connection to the land were faithfully recorded and shared. Individuals came to life on those glass plates, and their beauty captured for all time. Curtis widened the knowledge about how Native Americans lived, like in this Apache home. The artistic quality of many of his photos invoked the stories of so many varied tribes, and the everyday dramas of when they alone had dominion of the lands they inhabited. Curtis came to be an advocate for the people he studied and photographed, yet he subscribed, as did many, to the disappearing American Indian. While he treasured their pre-contact ways of life, he saw their only future in giving up those ways of life, disappearing as distinct people. Curtis saw the mammoth undertaking through to completion. All 20 volumes contain priceless content. Yet this did nothing for his financial situation. By the end, he sold his rights to the North American Indian, and the buyers never really made it widely available. The rigors of this work exhausted Curtis, but he did become close to his children later in life, never becoming wealthy, yet producing a wealth in images and knowledge. The work of Edward Curtis became largely forgotten until he became rediscovered in recent years. Many of his images can be found at the Library of Congress. Others found their way to Northwestern University. As for that 20-volume set he dedicated his life to produce, a very limited number were ever produced. Recently, a set sold for $60,000 at an auction. Ann Makepeace produced a movie about Curtis entitled Coming to Light. She wrote and edited a book by the same name, published by National Geographic. With dedicated and inspired artists, the images of Native Americans and their culture became increasingly accurate, a notable feat by non-Indians like Curtis. Yet when would Native Americans themselves produce their own images and tell their own stories? One answer came from a Cree named Richard Throssell. At the age of 20, he moved from Washington State to the Crow Reservation for health reasons. He found an outstanding art environment there. He took lessons from famed Taos painter Joseph Henry Sharp, and he learned photography guidance from Edward Curtis. Throssell evolved to develop his own style in his depiction of Crow Indian life. In less than 10 years, Throssell produced over 1,000 photographs of Crow and other American Indians. As a Native American himself, he was given access and permission to photograph sacred ceremonies and other aspects of Crow culture. His unique work was the capture of Indians caught in the moment, expressing a sense of familiarity not found in the images of non-native photographers. Throssell's body of work has passed into the public domain. He encouraged countless Native Americans to find their artistic voice, and left a priceless treasury of Native American images.